Hello and welcome to the last episode of Agri History Revisited. In this episode, cherries, take 2. Cherries come in many different forms and species. In this episode, we'll cover 3 types of cherries: sweet cherry, sour cherry, and Japanese cherry. First, you'll start with cherry classification. Sweet cherries are divided into 2 groups, based on the firmness of the fruit flesh. The first group is called the tender-fruited ones, also known as Julianas. The second group is called the Bigaro group. This group of cherries has firm flesh and a wide range of colors. In fact, the name is derived from bigar, and this word translates into variegated. There are also several varieties of sweet cherry that are used for ornamental purposes. Now on to the classification of sour cherries. The first group is often called Colina. This strain has trees of moderate to small stature, with hanging branches, with fruit with high-colored juice, with acidic flavor. The second group is called Kentish Cherries. They are large trees, with fruit with colorless juice. The third group is called Morellos. These fruit are relatively sweet, with dark red juice. These fruit trees are larger than average compared to the other sour cherry specimens. The fourth and final strain of tart cherry is called Marasca, meaning bitter, and as such the fruit have a bitter quality to them. The trees are also small. Now on to the Japanese cherries that are often used. The Japanese cherries include the species known as Prunus cerulata, Prunus pseudocaresis, and Prunus lanacea, all names I cannot pronounce very well. Although these days most of these Japanese cherries are hybrids between many species, and as such there are other methods to categorize them. The Japanese horticulturists divide them into village cherries and mountain cherries, and the researchers Jefferson and Wayne proposed that all Japanese cherries should be designated as part of the Zato Zakura group. While that ends classification, now on to the evolution and domestication of sweet and sour cherries. The earliest description of a cherry comes from Theophrastus in 300 BC, and from the description from his work, it was concluded by Dr. Candolle that he was referring to a sweet cherry. Dr. Candolle observed that sweet cherries grew in the forests of Gilhan, an area north of Persia but south of the Caucasus, as well as Armenia. It was also found in southern Russia, as well as parts of Sweden and the mountainous parts of Greece. He concluded that the sweet cherry had originated in an area south of the Caucasian mountains, and a secondary dissemination took place into Europe. The area selected by Dr. Candolle escaped the Quaternary Ice Age, and as such it is very possible that the secondary migration of cherry took place in Europe. However, parts of northern Italy, as well as the Balkan Peninsula, the Carpathian Basin, and most of France also escaped this ice age, and the cherries could also have survived in that area as well, therefore removing the need for a secondary migration to take place. But for all practical purposes, the wild sweet cherry has Europe as its full native territory. It is likely from these populations that the cherry was domesticated from. The first known writings directly about sweet cherries were as a medicinal plant, which could be used as a means to treat bellyache or a means to cause bellyache, as written by Discordus. Later on, in 117 to 27 BC, Terentius Varro described the mechanisms on how to graft the cherry tree in his book. This provides evidence that cherries were domesticated and common in that area for a long period of time prior to his writing. Nearly 150 years later, Pliny the Elder described many different cultivars of cherry in Rome. This included both sweet and sour cherries. Pliny the Elder also describes that sweet cherries were being grown in Italy, Portugal, Belgium, and parts of Germany during his time. As for how cherries got to Rome, it is said that Lucullus, a Roman general stationed in Asia Minor, brought back cherries upon his retirement in 67 BC. This may indicate that cherries were cultivated in Persia prior to that point, but we cannot take Pliny's words as pure proof of the origins of cherry domestication. It could have been a source, rather, of additional cherry cultivars. Although it's also written that within the gardens of Persia, that both sweet and sour cherries were being grown. Now on to the sour cherry. The sour cherry is described as being from the Caspian Sea by Dr. Kandel, with a range across parts of Turkey and Greece. Sour cherries are primarily used to make different baked goods, and many varieties are used to make a liquor called maraschino, made from the marasca cherries, which are black, sour, and bitter. This process was made prior to the 1700s. Although this practice is relatively recent, the gypsies that make this type of liqueur use unimproved cultivars of sour cherry found across the area, indicating that these are relatively wild specimens. So it's likely that these cherries are native to the Carpathian Basin as well. Dr. Hedrick later on assigned a much larger range for the sour cherry to dwell in. He speculated that the area that sour cherry is native to is bordered by Switzerland, the Adriatic Sea, Germany, and the Caspian Sea. Dr. Hedrick stated that the domestication of sour cherry had to be farthest west or north of Russia, due to the fact that many land races of sour cherry are found in that area. One example of a land race would be Pandy, a land race that's rediscovered around 1848. This cultivar came from the river Koros, a Hungarian river. This river flows from Romania to Hungary, and the Hungarians have many words for cherry that differ from the Russian words for cherry. For sweet cherry, they use the Russian word for cherry. For sour cherry, they use their own Hungarian word, megi. Based on linguistic evidence, it is likely that the species that we refer to as sour cherry is native to the region of Hungary, and as such, a possible location of domestication. Due to the similarities between the sweet cherry and a species of wild cherry called the ground cherry, speculated that this species originated as a hybrid between both species. And if you go back to my original video on, you will learn that this hypothesis seemed to be confirmed by the genetic evidence. Now on to the Japanese cherries. Now on to the history of Japanese cherries. In Japan, the cherry tree, or sakura, or zakura in Japanese, is one of the most exalted of all flowering plants in Japan. As early as the 5th century, the Japanese emperor paid homage to this cultivar group of cherries. They are often used for commemorations of different events, and this reverence only increased over the centuries. And by 1800, a collection of approximately 1,000 cherry trees containing 80 different cultivars was planted in Kyoto. The number of varieties obtained increased to 130 by 1990. The first Japanese cherries introduced to the United States were brought in by the nursery company L. Wanger and the Berry Corporation, as Japanese cherries were found in catalogs listed in 1846 and 1847. These companies were based in Rochester, New York, and Long Island, New York. The introduction of wild species of Japanese cherry was only started in 1876 when William S. Clark, the first president of the Agricultural College of that area, visited Japan and sent home some seeds of Prunus sargenti, a plant native to the mountains of northern Japan. In 1903, David Fairchild and Barbara Lathrop, the head of the Office of Foreign Plant Introduction, a subsidiary of the USDA, imported 30 cultivars of Japanese cherry trees into the United States. David Fairchild traveled to Japan in 1902, and due to the enjoyment of observing the Japanese cherry trees of that area, he ordered 75 flowering cherry trees and 25 weeping cherry trees from Japan. And by 1906 in May, they were all planted in the Fairchild estate of Chevy Chase. Afterwards, the Chevy Chase Land Company ordered 300 more trees to be planted in the community of Chevy Chase. The hoopla around Japanese cherry trees caused the wife of President Taft to become interested in the beautification process, and through her efforts, Superintendent of Public Buildings and Grounds, Colonel Spencer Cosby, ordered 90 double-flowering Japanese cherry trees from Hoops Brothers and the Thomas Corporation in April 1909 to be planted on public grounds. By June, Washington was all abuzz with newspapers and stories of a donation of cherry trees by the mayor of Tokyo to Mrs. Taft. In August 1909, the state of Tokyo donated 2,000 cherry trees to the US. They came, but unfortunately they're all contaminated with disease and insects, and had to be destroyed. Once the mayor heard about the bad news, the mayor had 6,000 new trees grafted and fumigated to remove any pests and disease from the trees, and then shipped them to the US. Half went to Washington, D.C., and the other half went to New York City. Due to the beauty of the flowering cherries sent to that area in Washington, the cherry tree became the most important symbol of Washington, D.C. This concludes our video on cherries. There's more information to talk about, specifically the archaeological information, but that could be a video all on its own. If you're interested in this information, please let me know and I'll make a video on this. BitChute exclusive, of course. That would be all. Peace out.